Good morning, dear Intriguer, and welcome to Intrigue Outloud. On today's show, I'm joined by Intrigue co-founder John Fowler to discuss the latest from Myanmar and a controversial political alliance in Spain. It's all coming up. Hey, John. How are you?
Ethan, I'm well. It feels like it's been at least 24 hours since I've seen you.
Yeah, how special is that? That's pretty cool. It was lovely meeting in person. Unfortunately, we're now yet again separated by a few thousand kilometers, but still great to see you. I still enjoy
Likewise.
these. Yeah,
me too.
Yeah. And John, we had some. We were chatting earlier about the big news we woke up to. The UK cabinet reshuffle, much anticipated cabinet reshuffle. Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, very controversial figure, was sacked, as they say in the UK. And to take her place was James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary. And taking James Cleverly's spot was actually, let's just roll this clip.
By car coming up number 10. Downing Street, I should say. I'm not quite sure who this might be. If somebody's sacked, then of course they don't come up Downing Street. That's done in private. That's the security detail just opening the door for
David Cameron. What? Wait. I was not expecting that.
Okay. I don't know if I love that so much.
It's classic. I love that it honestly feels like a bit of like a sport. I mean, royal watching is a sport. Now it's kind of ministerial reshuffle watching has become a sport.
I mean, did you hear and listeners, go back if you didn't, the very faint "what the hell" that a producer must have said in the back? I mean, the British have great senses of humor. But I think sometimes. Even that clip showed even they are shocked by the incredible silliness that their politics can sometimes deliver.
Absolutely.
What did you make of this move? Also, remind us who David Cameron is.
Well, yeah, I mean, he's the former Prime Minister of the UK, the infamous one who took them, or at least presided over the referendum that took them out of Europe. He's a pretty well established and experienced figure. One thing about him being the new Foreign Secretary is he'll have lots of friends that he's already met around the world, so that'll be a plus. But I don't have many comments other than just like I was shocked, and I almost woke up saying "what the hell" as well, to be honest.
One thing interesting that I found was David Cameron now, because he's been appointed Foreign Secretary rather, gets a seat in the House of Lords. He's now a member of Parliament. So not only is he an unelected official serving as Foreign Secretary, the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, is an unelected Prime Minister, not elected by the people. He was elected by Conservative Party members. So two of the most senior members of British government were not elected, which is sort of strange.
Yeah, well, Ethan, I guess you can't let a good old-fashioned democracy get in the way of weird traditions where people get elected to sit in bodies for life for, various reasons. But yeah.
Never. How could you? Well, John, you mentioned David Cameron will come back with a lot of friends, but he's missed a lot. It's been 7 years since he served in government. So let's talk about some of the things on his agenda. One thing would be the ongoing conflict in Myanmar between, forces backed by the ruling military junta and rebels. So, John, if you found yourself in number 10 to deliver the daily briefing, what would you tell Mr. Cameron about what's happening there?
Well, actually, Ethan, it's number 1 at Carlton Gardens, where the Foreign Secretary resides, I'm afraid to tell you.
Oh, pish posh, John, come on.
I think probably should save our listeners' ears from doing accents. To be honest, the situation in Myanmar isn't a particularly funny one. A lot's changed over the last couple of weeks lately. We've actually been watching this for a few weeks. I know we discussed talking about it earlier on this podcast, but we kind of wanted to just wait and see how it developed. And where it's at now is an alliance of rebel militias known as the Brotherhood Alliance. Well, they began an enormous offensive a couple of weeks back. 27th of October it started, which they've called this offensive Operation 1027 to mark the date of starting it. I think over the first 2-3 weeks of this offensive, it's really developed into something that the Myanmar ruling military junta needs to take seriously. They've overrun potentially hundreds of military outposts, but it's hard to know just how many, obviously, along some of the more major trade routes in the country. They killed the military commander in the region, and they captured at least 7 towns. Now, Ethan, 7 towns might not sound like much, but together they're more than 8,000 square kilometers of territory, and that's larger than the state of Delaware, or if you're not aware of what Delaware is, about 6 times larger than the size of Greater London, which might be a more relevant touch point for our international listeners.
And for Mr. Cameron.
And for Mr. Cameron, exactly, who I'm briefing. I forgot about that. Yeah. But I think even more important than the territorial advance and capturing of territory is the fact that these rebels are closing in on the border with China. That's where about 40% of cross-border trade for Myanmar takes place. Obviously critical to revenues for the country and for the military junta. I think it's pretty obvious that if those border crossings are sort of overrun by the rebel militias and they're seized, it'd be a huge blow to the incomes for the country and also to the credibility of the military junta for being able to kind of exercise control over the country's borders, right? And then on top of all of that, we heard reports early yesterday that another rebel group, encouraged by the success of the Brotherhood Alliance. Brotherhood Alliance, I should say, is in that northeast Shan state of Myanmar. They have a couple of borders up there. But this other group that's been encouraged in the western part of Myanmar, up near its border with Bangladesh, they've launched a corresponding offensive. So, the junta seems to have a pretty big problem on its hand, a multi-frontal assault in different parts of what is a very remote country. And I think it's probably the biggest challenge to their rules since they came back to power, obviously, in 2021.
Well, Mr. Cameron hasn't held political office since 2016. He certainly wasn't around when the junta took power. So catch him up to speed.
Well, newly made.
And do it with a smile.
A bit of a pep in my step. Lord Cameron, the military returned. You'll have been aware of the military junta, obviously, in the past, but they returned to power in 2021 after they toppled the democratically elected government of Aung San Suu Kyi. They were obviously the preeminent force in Burmese politics for decades. In 1990, for example, they agreed to hold elections despite being in charge of the country. But then when the result didn't go the way they wanted, they refused to hand over power when Aung San Suu Kyi, who was a very famous, pro-democracy leader in what was then known, I think, more broadly as Burma, they refused to hand power over to her. She was actually the daughter of Myanmar's modern founder. So she's like a real, political royalty in the country. And they actually put her under house arrest. And that's where a lot of folks might have known her name originally from, was that she was, famously imprisoned in the 90s in a kind of beacon of democracy in the region. Anyway, the junta continued to rule Myanmar up until 2015 when they agreed to hold yet more elections, perhaps under the same assumption that they would win. Guess who won? Aung San Suu Kyi.
Aung San Suu Kyi.
Yep, yeah. She came back. She came back around. Pretty remarkable longevity, really, when you think about it. But she did so overwhelmingly. She won 58% of the seats in parliament. Her party did, anyway. And the next biggest party back in 2015 won only 7%. So massive win. And then she won again in 2020. And this time by even more. But the military, having been sort of out or on the fringes of power for 5 years or so, said that was enough. They called the election in 2020 fraudulent and came back to power in essentially a coup, and they imprisoned her again.
How did the people of Myanmar respond?
Well, I think it's fair to say in a way that the junta probably didn't expect. There were protests. They were really angry protests on the street, which, is kind of not something that I think anyone expected at the time. Almost as soon as that coup took place, opposition leaders started to coalesce around what's now known as the National Unity Government. And that's really just this name for a vast collection of different groups that generally oppose the military rule. The groups tend to be divided along ethnic lines, some on political lines. And in lots of circumstances, I think they share very little in common other than that opposition to the military. And then obviously, talking about unpredictable responses, the junta's response was very predictable. It was vicious. It was a crackdown. It made news right around the world. And since then, they've used their technological superiority and air power and just military power, really, to pursue a fairly indiscriminate campaign, including bombing rebels. And it's, real scorched earth stuff too, burning villages, displacing people. Horrific, really.
Yeah, I think tempering indiscriminate with the word fairly may not be necessary. I mean, we're talking about bombing outdoor festivals, bombing villages just full of civilians. Horrific tactics. And I hesitate to use this word, but have they been effective for the military?
Yeah, I know what you mean when you say you're hesitant. Effective is a distasteful word to use when we're talking about this kind of stuff. But I guess what you're asking is, has it helped them achieve their goals, no matter how horrific those goals are? And I think the answer to that question is maybe at first, back in sort of 2021, 2022. But I think now with time, it's actually helped galvanize the opposition against them. I think opposition groups have been able to point to these horrific tactics and rally support for them. Those disparate groups that I just said shared so little in common, they're coordinating more. They're being able to put aside whatever differences they had because of these tactics that the military has used. And earlier this year, and I found this fascinating when we were preparing for the show, the junta only claimed stable control of around 20% of Myanmar's townships. And it's a number that seems to be falling every day.
I mean, that's nothing. 20%. Right. That's not quite being in control of the country, is it?
No, it's really not. That's why I was shocked. And worse still for the junta, its soldiers seem to have been deserting them en masse as well. It was once a 400,000 strong force of soldiers and, in the military. It's now apparently less than about 150,000. And, with each of these battles and each of these defeats to these rebel groups, I'd expect more of the military's junta's soldiers to desert or defect. I'm certainly no military expert, but I'd be kind of shocked if the junta was in a position now, given the desertions, of launching a counteroffensive against these groups to sort of reassert their control over Myanmar. That the best they may be able to do from here is to kind of hold on to power, hold the capital, hold some of the major cities, and just try to wait them out, maybe.
Well, how long do you think they can do that?
Look, I don't think I can make a guess on that, and I'm not sure it's particularly helpful. I think it's important, though, not to forget that this area, Shan State, not only borders China, as we said before, but it borders Laos and Thailand as well. So there's a bunch of countries in the region that'll be paying really, really close attention to how this develops. Now, obviously, my favorite topic, the big one here, is China and how they react. I think China will overlook just about any kind of behavior in countries that it shares borders with, as long as that behavior means they keep the country stable. You think of North Korea and what it puts up with, or what it allows to happen in North Korea, because North Korea can keep that border stable. And I think that's why Beijing has been one of Myanmar junta's most sort of important backers for a couple of years now. But over the past few months, and especially since late October when this offensive began, we've seen some signs that they might be rethinking their support. Now, I don't think there's any sense of what would come after the junta if that's the way this goes. So Beijing's never going to agitate for change. That's not their style. They're not kind of, making sounds that they want to change in Myanmar. But I wouldn't be surprised that if a credible political force emerges in Myanmar in the near future, that Beijing wouldn't start reaching out, having conversations with it behind the scenes in anticipation of a Myanmar that isn't run by the junta. Now, of course, all of this can fizzle out, but I don't know. Sometimes something just tells me this time is different, Ethan.
Today's episode is sponsored by us. Yes, us. We're joining our friends at The Gist, the L-Vest, Nice News, and Dollar Flight Club to give away $2,000 to one lucky winner. You heard me. $2,000. All you have to do to sign up is click the link in the show notes, add your name and email address, and if you're lucky, you'll have a couple grand at your door in time for Black Friday. You definitely don't want to miss this. All right, welcome back. So, John, Lord Foreign Secretary Cameron, whatever the Brits call their politicians, he was so impressed with your briefing on Myanmar that he's called you back for another session, this time to keep him abreast on some political turmoil on the Iberian Peninsula.
Ah, Europe. Yes. David Cameron's favorite topic, of course.
Now you're being cruel.
loves talking about it. But no, you'll have to be a bit more specific about the Iberian Peninsula, Ethan, because it feels like there's been multiple causes of turmoil on the Iberian Peninsula lately. I mean, we've had huge protests in Spain over the weekend. Portugal's prime minister resigned in what I think was a fairly big shock to everyone in the region amidst a corruption scandal. And even tiny Andorra, which is the answer to so many trivia questions, it's in the midst of a major housing crisis.
Ooh, yeah, well, John, lots to choose from. I admittedly had Spain in mind when I brought this up. Not that my interest isn't piqued on the others, but what's the story with these protests?
I think that's the right one to pick. That's the one that I think has the most sort of geopolitical relevance. So I think to understand these protests, to start off, we actually have to go back a couple of months to Spain's most recent election, which was held in July. And it ended in a draw. No single party won enough seats to form a majority, and no group of parties seemed to have enough support to form a coalition that could then go on and have enough seats to form a majority. So Spain has been kind of stuck in this limbo ever since. And its incumbent prime minister, a chap by the name of Pedro Sanchez, who our erstwhile colleague Helen called a tall drink of water over the weekend. Apparently he's a very good-looking chap. But we
didn't look him up. Yeah.
But he's been serving as the interim prime minister while other party leaders have been jockeying for support to form that coalition and take government, right? I think it became pretty clear, rather quickly after the election, that the conservative Vox party wouldn't be able to get enough support to form a government. There were too many parties that opposed them. So responsibility turned yet again to Sanchez and his Socialist Party to see if they could figure out a way to get a coalition and lead the country.
And how is he / they, the Socialist Party, how have they done that?
Well, Ethan, this is where I think it transforms from a fairly average, boring European political story about forming coalitions into an interesting one, because Sanchez has had to turn to a somewhat surprising kingmaker in the Catalan separatist party called the Junts party. They won just 7 of the Spanish parliament's 350 seats. So that's one of the reasons that it's surprising. He's done that over the last couple of months, I mentioned, since the election, and he's done it in some interesting ways. One has been to petition the EU to include Catalan, the language Catalan, in the EU's list of official languages, alongside other regional languages in Spain like Basque and Galician. But EU officials, unfortunately for Sanchez and Catalans, pretty much immediately rejected that plan. So back to square one for Pedro Sanchez. And last week, after again, months of negotiations, he did something kind of incredible, I think. So in exchange for the Junts party support, Sanchez agreed to a blanket amnesty deal for the folks that took part in Catalonia's independence movement 6 years ago. And some people might remember there were widespread protests, which actually led to the leader of that Junts party being kind of forced into self-exile, a man by the name of Carles Puigdemont. And he's been living abroad since 2017. Now, under this new deal, he can come back to Spain and be sure that he won't be slapped in irons and put in prison.
I'm so glad you mentioned his name, John, because I've also been eager to say his name. Give
it a go.
The context I'm getting there. You bear with me. The context you just laid out for us brings us to the protests, which I would take as a sign that not everyone in Spain is as pleased with this deal as Puigdemont probably is.
There you go. It is quite satisfying to say, isn't it? No, you're right. And there've been massive protests too. These aren't just kind of run-of-the-mill sort of protests. We're talking hundreds of thousands of folks in the streets of Madrid all throughout last week and over the weekend. And these protests, I think, were organised by the Vox party that we mentioned before. From the protesters' perspective, I suppose it looks to them like Sanchez is striking a deal to become the leader of Spain, the Spanish prime minister, with a group of people who explicitly do not want to be Spanish themselves,
right.
Which is kind of an odd kind of optic, right? And I think it's fair to say that many in Spain, obviously not all, but many in Spain despise Puigdemont. So I think we'll find later this week if his gambit, Sanchez's gambit, is going to be successful, because Parliament will debate and then vote for a new prime minister on Thursday. But I suspect there will be some long-term consequences for even trying to to form this coalition. In the months leading up to Spain's election, I think the big news was how worried many parties or many people and countries were across Europe that this Vox party could come to power. They're sort of the right-wing populists of Spain. I'm not really sure how the EU feels about an empowered Catalonian separatist movement if Sanchez does return to power, but I know that many Spaniards are not going to let this go anytime soon.
Smashing, John. Smashing work. We'll see you back at number 10 sometime soon.
Thanks, Ethan, or Lord Cameron, or I'm confused.
Whoever I am. And that's going to do it for me. By the way, I'm sure you've been missing us in your inbox over the past few days, but we'll be back with a brand new edition of the International Intrigue newsletter first thing Wednesday morning. In the meantime, I'm Ethan Plotkin. See you on Friday.